The summer heat arrived earlier than anyone expected. By June, the fields were already turning brown. By July, the creek that had supplied water to farms across the valley had become nothing more than a line of cracked mud. And by August, farmers were watching their crops die one row at a time. But there was one farm that looked completely different. Its corn was tall. Its vegetables were green. Its fruit trees were still producing. And beneath the scorching sun, the soil was strangely dark and damp. The owner of that farm was a quiet woman named Mara Bennett. Just months earlier, her neighbors had laughed at her. They had watched her spend weeks digging long, narrow trenches across her property. Nobody understood what she was doing. Some called the trenches ugly. Others called them pointless. One neighbor even told her, "You're wasting your time digging holes when you should be planting." Mara never argued. She simply kept digging. Before we continue, subscribe to Steady Farmer if you enjoy emotional farming stories about ordinary people who refuse to give up when everyone else says they're wrong. Because what Mara was building wasn't a collection of useless trenches. It was a plan for a drought she believed was coming. Mara had inherited the 80-acre farm from her grandfather. It wasn't the biggest farm in the valley, and it certainly wasn't the richest. But her grandfather had taught her something when she was young. "Don't only watch the crops," he used to tell her. "Watch the water." Mara remembered those words years later when she noticed something strange. The winter had been unusually dry. Then spring brought heavy rain for only a few days. Most farmers celebrated. Mara didn't. She stood at the edge of her field and watched rainwater rush downhill. Within hours, thousands of gallons disappeared into the creek. The water had arrived too quickly. The land couldn't absorb it. Mara realized that the problem wasn't always a lack of rain. Sometimes, the problem was where the rain went. So she began studying the natural slope of her farm. She marked the places where water rushed fastest. Then she started digging. The trenches weren't deep enough to be dangerous. They were carefully positioned across the slope, following the natural contours of the land. When rain came, the trenches would slow the water down. Instead of rushing away, the water would spread across the field and gradually soak into the soil. Mara also planted grasses and deep-rooted cover crops around several trenches. She wanted the roots to hold the soil together. She wanted the land to become a sponge. Her neighbors thought she had lost her mind. One afternoon, a farmer named Dale stopped his truck beside the fence. He looked at the trenches and shook his head. "You're turning a perfectly good field into a ditch system." Mara smiled. "I'm trying to keep the water here." Dale laughed. "Water doesn't stay here." Mara looked toward the dark clouds forming over the distant hills. "Maybe it will." The first test came 3 weeks later. A powerful storm moved across the valley. Rain hammered the fields for nearly 6 hours. Farmers hurried to protect their equipment. Mara stood beneath the porch roof and watched. Water poured down her fields. But instead of racing toward the creek, it entered the trenches. The trenches filled. Then the water slowly spread outward. Within a few hours, the rushing water had disappeared. The next morning, Mara walked through her fields. The soil was wet, not muddy, not flooded, just deeply soaked. She knew the water had gone somewhere important, down into the ground. Her neighbors weren't impressed. They saw only muddy trenches. They didn't realize Mara had just stored thousands of gallons of rain beneath the surface. Then summer arrived, and the rain stopped. At first, nobody worried. Farmers had survived dry summers before, but week after week passed. The temperature climbed, the creek became smaller, then smaller again. By the middle of July, the valley's irrigation ponds were dropping rapidly. Farmers began rationing water. Some stopped watering their least productive fields. Others sold livestock because they couldn't afford to keep them alive. Mara watched everything carefully. She didn't celebrate. She knew what was happening to her neighbors could happen to her too. Every morning, she walked her fields. She pushed her hand into the soil. The surface was dry, but beneath it, the ground was still cool. Her trenches had done exactly what she hoped. The heavy spring rains had been captured and stored underground. The roots of her cover crops had helped create channels through the soil. And because she had covered much of the ground with mulch, less moisture evaporated under the brutal summer sun. Her crops were still using water, but they weren't depending entirely on what fell from the sky that week. They were using the water Mara had convinced the land to keep months earlier. By August, the valley looked completely different. Cornfields turned brown. Vegetable gardens collapsed. Pastures became yellow and brittle. The creek disappeared completely. Farmers drove farther and farther to find water. One morning, Dale stopped his truck outside Mara's gate. He stared through the fence. Her tomato plants were green. Her corn stood tall. Even the grass around her orchard was still alive. "How?" he finally asked. Mara walked toward him. "Remember the trenches?" Dale looked down. For once, he didn't laugh. "You stored the rain?" Mara nodded. "Some of it. But there hasn't been rain in weeks." "I know." Dale looked across her farm. "So where is the water coming from?" Mara pointed toward the ground. "From underneath us." Word spread quickly. Farmers began visiting Mara's property. Some came because they were curious. Others came because they were desperate. They expected some expensive irrigation system hidden underground. There wasn't one. No giant reservoir. No secret well. No miracle machine. Just careful planning. Mara showed them her soil. She explained how the trenches slowed runoff, how vegetation protected the ground, how mulch reduced evaporation, how healthy soil could hold more water than exhausted, exposed soil. And most importantly, she explained that the work had started months before the drought. "You can't wait until the field is dying to prepare for drought," she told them. "You prepare while the land still has something to give you." The farmers listened. This time, nobody laughed. A week later, Dale came back. He brought 3 other farmers with him. They had questions. Lots of them. Mara spent the entire afternoon walking them around her property. She showed them where the water entered the trenches. She showed them the areas where the soil stayed moist longest. Then she gave them an old notebook. Inside were the measurements and observations she had recorded throughout the year. Dale looked through the pages. "You really planned all this?" Mara smiled. "No." He looked confused. "I planned for the possibility that I could be wrong." She pointed toward the dry valley. "And I planned for the possibility that I could be right." The drought lasted nearly 4 months. It became one of the harshest summers the valley had experienced in decades. Mara's farm wasn't untouched. Some crops struggled. Some leaves wilted. A few fields produced less than expected. But the farm survived. More importantly, the lessons from that farm began spreading. When the first autumn rains finally arrived, dozens of farmers were waiting. Instead of allowing the water to rush away, they began slowing it down. They dug their own contour trenches. They planted cover crops. They added organic matter to their soil. They covered bare ground. They started thinking differently about water, not as something that simply fell from the sky, but as something worth catching. Months later, Mara stood at the edge of her farm, watching a group of neighboring farmers work on their own fields. Dale walked over. "You know," he said, "I owe you an apology." Mara smiled. For what? For calling your trenches useless? Mara looked across the valley. You weren't the only one. Dale laughed. I know. Then he became serious. Why didn't you fight back when everyone mocked you? Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Because the land doesn't care who laughs. Dale nodded. And I figured that eventually, the land would answer for me. Mara looked at the trenches stretching across her fields. They no longer looked useless. They looked like scars carved into the earth by someone who had understood what everyone else had missed. The drought had not made Mara lucky. It had simply revealed the value of the work she had done when nobody believed it mattered. And that became the lesson the whole valley remembered. Sometimes, the smartest thing a farmer can do is prepare for a problem before anyone else believes it is coming. Because when the rain disappears, there is no time left to start preparing. And sometimes, what looks like a useless trench today can become the reason your farm is still alive tomorrow. If you enjoyed Mara's story, subscribe to Steady Farmer and turn on notifications for more inspiring farming stories where patience, preparation, and determination change everything.